Taylor from Simpler Trading, and I want to show you real quick how we found the perfect squeeze setup in T-Mobile. So on the big three,
we were the first central bank, and we were the most, supportive, and I think that work will hold together when historians are looking back on it in a long time. I think when you get to the inflation era, that becomes a different question, and people are going to be arguing about that for a long time.
As a result of the action we took, and the economy was thought to slow down a fair bit, and many people use the phrase hard landing to describe, hard landing is a euphemism for a recession, I guess. People thought in 2023 we might have a hard landing. People thought in 2024 we might have a hard landing. And none of these people were economists, professionally trained economists, but they seem to be wrong. So do you rely on these economists very much in the future when you're projecting whether you should listen to their views on where the economy is going, or how do you react to the fact that we haven't had a hard landing and disappointed all those economists?
So I'll just say that, as someone famously said, predictions are very difficult, especially about the future. Right. And also, I know a lot of economic forecasters, and forecasters are a humble lot with much to be humble about. It is extremely difficult. Every good forecaster will tell you that it's very, very hard to know what the economy is going to do. To give you a good example, in our Teal book, every FOMC cycle, there's a book that goes out, and there's a baseline forecast in that. And our forecasters are really the top people in the field, and they give you that baseline. They also give you a section in that book which shows 7 or 8 alternative scenarios, which they also regard as plausible. So it's always a probability thing like that. It's like we've identified this one thing. So last year was a big surprise, and it was a big upside surprise. So of course we welcome those. We'd be happy to have more of those. But it just was one of those things where where things turned out much better for a whole variety of reasons. I will say that on the hard landing question, I have always felt like that there was a pathway to getting inflation back down to our 2% goal on a sustainable basis without the kind of pain in the labor market, the kind of high unemployment that has been typical of tightening cycles and getting inflation down. And the reason why my colleagues and I thought that was that the labor market was so overheated that it could cool down quite a bit without having to. There still is apparently no slack in the labor market. The labor market does not have slack. Essentially, you're at equilibrium now. But look where inflation is. Inflation's at 2.5%. So this was in defiance of a lot of conventional wisdom, but we thought that was right. And that says that you have to be, one thing you learn is humility in forecasting. So I wouldn't rule it out, but I would say that the kind of hard landing scenario is certainly not the most likely or a likely scenario.
So you have said you have a target of 2% inflation. You want to get it in sight of 2%. Do you have a similar target for unemployment? If unemployment went to 4%, are you saying, well, that's okay because we don't need to do anything because 4% is tolerable? Or do you have such a similar kind of target as you do with inflation?
So you can't reduce unemployment to a single number for a couple reasons. First of all, the natural rate of unemployment probably moves through the cycle and over time. Maximum employment is a function of many, many different variables. It doesn't reduce itself to a specific number that would be durable over time. So inflation has 2% inflation some years ago became the global standard that everyone aims for in one way or another.
Some people have suggested that the Fed's independence is not as good as people talk about it being, and that maybe we'd better have more White House coordination with the Fed. I'm sure you've heard about this.
I think that...
Any comments on that?
I'd be happy to comment on what independence, on the point of central bank independence. So I think a long time ago, people have learned that a central bank that's independent of political consideration does a better job getting inflation under control. And that is accepted wisdom in all advanced economies around the world. It's also a principle that has very, very strong and broad support where it really matters, which is in Congress. You talk to senior leaders in both chambers, in both political parties, and they all understand that you want an independent central bank that doesn't run monetary policy to support or oppose any particular politician or political party.
Independence is one thing, but you still have some information sharing. So how do you coordinate or share information with the administration? Do you regularly meet with the Secretary of Treasury or White House staff people, or how do you communicate with them?
So there's a very standard set of relationships which doesn't change at all, administration to administration, and you can start anywhere, but Council of Economic Advisors is in the White House. We have lunch with them every month or so, although they get canceled sometimes because we're all busy. That's one thing. I have breakfast with the Secretary of the Treasury every week, unless she's traveling or I'm traveling. I have, since there was a National Economic Council, there's been a regular / sometimes irregular breakfast with the head of the NEC, and I do that too.
Do you ever get a call from the President of the United States saying interest rates are too high or something like that?
So, ever? No, I would say that, meetings with the President are rare and appropriately so.
Okay. So you were originally appointed to the board of the Fed by President Obama,
yes.
And you were appointed chair by President Trump and reappointed by President Biden, and your term as chair goes through, I think, May of 2026.
That's right.
So any thought about staying through all the way through May 2026? You're going to do that?
Yes.
Okay. And if some president came along and said, well, you did a great job, I'd like to reappoint you, would you consider that?
I have nothing for you on that today.
Okay. All right. And is being chair of the Fed a enjoyable job or not so much?
It is, actually. I think I enjoy it. I enjoy it quite a bit. I do. First of all, it's a great honor. It's incredibly interesting. I love the people we work with. I love the institution. At this time in my life, it's just been a great thing. I'm in my 13th year there now, and it's been really challenging and all that. But what else would you want? I'm very happy doing the job.
So you're obviously in pretty good shape. How do you stay in shape? Do you walk a lot, or you ride bikes, or what do you do?
Yes, I do those things. I swim, I ride my bike, I go to the gym a lot. I try to stay fit, as you will remember from our days together.
Right. So but when you were, let's say, riding a bike, do people, get out of the way, or do you have?
Nobody knows you with a bike helmet and goggles on. You're just another person on the road.
So I think you have said somewhere that when the Fed does lower interest rates, not saying that you're saying it's going to do that, but if the Fed does lower interest rates at some point, you didn't think it was ever going to go back to kind of the free money practically of years ago when interest rates were almost zero. Is that a fair statement, that you don't think it's a good idea to go back to interest rates as low as they once were?
The period between the global financial crisis and the pandemic was historically unusual from the standpoint that we had ever lower interest rates through that era, including part of the era when, for example, sovereign debt of major European sovereigns was trading at a significantly negative rate. And so that was quite unusual. And still, even with rates that low, inflation was very low, below target. And so the question is what caused that, and are the forces that caused that gone for now? And I think most people attribute the low inflation era to slow-moving forces like demographics, globalization, technological evolution, things like that. And those may or may not have changed. But nonetheless, I look at where we are now. Our funds rate is at 5.3%, roughly, give or take. And it feels like it's restrictive, but not severely restrictive. So it tells me that rates, at least for now, the neutral rate must have risen, probably has risen from where it was during the inter-crisis period. And I think instinctively, I can't prove this. We're going to learn about this empirically, but it seems to me that the neutral rate is probably higher than it was during the inter-crisis period, and so rates will be higher.
So the Federal Reserve, without saying you're going to lower interest rates at this point, if you did lower interest rates at some time, I thought you had said you didn't want to lower interest rates and then maybe say, well, maybe we made a mistake and we're going to increase them again. You want to have a policy that's fairly consistent for a while. In other words, lower interest rates but not bounce back and forth every FOMC meeting. Is that a fair summary?
That wouldn't be a praise it and that kind of thing, and that's the mornings. And in the afternoon, people go take a hike. And let me be clear, this is not a rate hike. It's an actual physical hike.
But you usually make a speech out there, I think,
yes.
every year.
That's traditionally, not every, I've done this every year, but not every Fed chair has done it every year. But I give the opening speech, and it doesn't have to have anything to do with the topic of the conference. I just give a speech. And
is it carefully worked on by the staff? You make sure you say something that sounds interesting, but you don't make any news?
No, actually, so I try to do, typically what I do is I talk about it's really focused on the economic outlook and that kind of thing at any given point in time. At Jackson Hole, I've tried to take a step back or move to a higher level and try to say things that have a little more generality to them and see what can we learn, for example.
Now, the Federal Reserve is over 100 years old. It was created under Woodrow Wilson. If you were around then, what would you have suggested they do better than they did in creating the system? Or do you think the system works pretty well after 100 years and you wouldn't change it very much?
So I'm giving myself perfect hindsight here. I would do what Congress did in 1933. So the original Fed didn't have an FOMC, and it really didn't function very well during the early parts of the Depression or during other. So in 1933, the current structure was put in place, and that's with the FOMC, with the number of governors and the voting arrangements. And I think that arrangement is fine. It works really well. In the 70s, the dual mandate was added, but ultimately, we're not looking for any law change. We think we have the authorities that we need. We think that the law is in just a fine place.
Okay, so basically, you think the system works reasonably well.
I do.
As it is today. And today, what is the biggest economic challenge you think facing the country? Is it growth? Is it inflation? Hard landing potentially? Or what are you most worried about? What keeps you up at night, if anything, in the economy?
So I'll say in the short term, that's what keeps me up. Like literally, the thing I'm thinking about in the middle of the night is always this balance we have between not wanting to, if we ease too early, we can undermine the progress on inflation. And if we wait too late, we can undermine economic activity. We can undermine the expansion. And, so we want to get this right. And getting it right is incredibly important for the people we serve. So that is really, that's what I spend a lot of my, thinking time on. Longer term, there are lots of things to worry about, but that's really what keeps me up.
So most people, they have dinner with friends or sometimes. How can you have dinner with friends without hinting at what you're thinking about? And do you ever get suggestions from your friends at dinner, this is what you should do? And how do you respond when they kind of say, maybe you should lower interest rates? You just keep eating or what?
You might define the word friend to mean doesn't ask you about interest rates. So, no, people don't do that generally. People I don't know will always say, hey, cut rates. Somebody said that in the elevator this morning.
Did that influence you or no?
I said, thank you, sir. No, but I mean, people say things, but, it's fine.
Okay, so today, for somebody that would like to be the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board in the future, is it a job you would recommend to your best friend or your best enemy?
I think it's a great job. I think, again, the last thing Chairman Bernanke said to me as he was that day, I went to see him that day, his last day at the Fed, he said, you learn so much at the Fed. And remember, Ben Bernanke was a top 5 monetary economist in the world when he arrived at the Fed. So he learned a lot at the Fed. So can you imagine how much I've learned, starting? So it's never felt like work. It's so interesting all the time. And also, the dedication of the people who work there, 90, and the staff, these are people who have chosen a life of not being in the public spotlight. They just want to do their work and serve the public, and they're very dedicated. It's a wonderful place, and I would recommend the job.
So the Fed is also responsible for, the way the Fed is set up, you're worried about a stable currency, I assume, and stable, well, not currency, you're worried about,
stable prices.
Inflation.
Yeah.
And you're worried about unemployment, but you have you don't make any decisions about what the impact is going to be on the currency or the dollar. In other words, the impact of what you decide to do on the dollar is not something you're mandated to worry about. Is that right?
That's right. The administration has that portfolio, the management of the dollar, for what that is. It used to be something different than what it is now. But for us, the effects of the things that we do or don't do on the dollar are just another financial variable, like equity prices or things like that.
Hey, but if you worry about inflation, as you obviously are, what about the debt the United States has? We have $35 trillion of outstanding in government indebtedness, and we're adding about $1.6 to $2 trillion more or less every year. Aren't you worried about that on the impact of the economy on inflation?
So I am very worried over time about the deficits that we're running. It's not the Fed's job. We don't give Congress advice, but let me just say that we're on an unsustainable path. That doesn't mean that the level of debt we have is unsustainable. It's not. But the path we're on, where we're running, large deficits at a time of full employment and healthy growth, is not a sustainable one over time. And we really need to get to work on that. I would hope this is a top line issue for elected people whose job it is not our job. And I believe that I do talk to quite a few elected officials in Congress, and I think there is a rising sense that it's time to do something about that. And it will take bipartisan action to address.
Let me ask you, in dealing with Congress, you testify, I think at least twice a year before members of Congress. You do the House side and the Senate side. Have you ever suggested them having a joint committee so you don't have to say the same thing twice, or they don't like that?
This is in the law. It's twice in February and twice in July, so it's 4 times a year. This is the Humphrey Hawkins put that in, and it's a tradition. And so the Senate went first last week. The House went first in this March, so they alternate. I think it would take, I don't know what it would take.
Do you get a lot of questions from members that you think are really adding a lot of good advice to you? Or
I think the members ask excellent questions, yes. Thank you for asking. They do. I'm generally very much pleased.
But you spend a fair amount of time with members of Congress compared to some of your predecessors. Is that because you think that they add a lot of value, or you just think it's a good courtesy to do that?
I think it's part of our job. In our system of government, it is the legislature that has oversight over the Fed. It's not the executive branch. In a parliamentary system, they're sort of one and the same. So it's the two committees, and so I spend a great deal of time up on the Hill talking to people in both political parties, House and Senate, just finding out what's on their mind and really trying to take on board their thoughts on the economy and on what we're doing. And I think they appreciate that. And I think that to me is really a big part of this job.
The Fed depends on data, but how good is the Fed data collection efforts? In other words, are you using the same data collection methods you used 20, 30 years ago, or because of technology, you have better data collection methods than before? And are you convinced you have data that's as good as the private sector has?
Most of the data that we get is the same that everybody else gets. The unemployment data, the inflation data, not collected by the Fed. We do some data collection, and we've actually been, dabbling in big data efforts for more than a decade. So I think we're very focused on the quality of data and collecting different kinds of economic data. During the pandemic, of course, it became necessary to do find all sorts of different sorts of data to reflect what was going on in the economy. We did a lot of that too.
So when you became the chair of the Fed, what was the best advice somebody gave you who was a previous chair of the Fed?
What comes to mind, I can't think of one thing. I thought that what Chairman Greenspan said was get a set of earmuffs.
And when you eventually are not the chair of the Fed and if somebody succeeds you, what would be the advice you would give them about how to be a good chair of the Fed?
To me, I think it's a very special American institution, and it's one that works to serve all Americans. And absolutely critical to that is staying in our lane, sticking to our knitting, not running to reach out to the big hot political issues of the day. And I think that's critical, because once you do that, if that's going to be what you do, what's the case for your independence?
The quickest way from a billion points of data to a point of view. SAS
Probably will say to my successor.
And when you want to go out to, let's have a dinner in a restaurant, do you worry that people are listening to what you're saying, they're eavesdropping, or you don't say anything that anybody has to make you worry about?
So that is exactly what I worry about. I have found that I get recognized now, and people at the next table are always listening. So we don't really go to restaurants.
So what do? You just go in a private room, or you don't go to restaurants?
If you're at a restaurant, you need to be in a private room because, of course, the people free tape. And if, by the way, if someone at your table were to be well served and start to speak loudly, everyone's hearing that too. So you got to be. We just don't do that for now. We go to we eat at home a lot. We eat at friends' houses.
Okay. Well, your wife is here. Where is she? She's right there. How long have you been married now?
15.
Oh,
39 years.
39. You had to add that up.
Do the arithmetic, yeah.
39 years. And and you have how many children?
3 children.
And any grandchildren?
We have 3 grandchildren, 3 little boys, the oldest of whom is 3, and all in the same family. So this is going to be quite a little place to visit.
Okay. Well, look, we've known each other a long time. I congratulate you on doing a great job at the Fed and avoiding the hard landing. And thanks for earlier telling me when you're going to lower interest rates in our private meeting. I now know when interest rates are going to go down. No, actually, that's not true.
Said you wouldn't tell anyone.
Right. Okay. Of course. Jay, thanks for a great job you're doing for the country.
Thank you, David.
Fed Chair Jerome Powell sitting down with our very own David Rubenstein at the Economic Club of Washington. Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. We are broadcasting to you live from the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee. I'm Kaylee Lines alongside Joe Matthew. Where, Joe, we are expecting to hear a great deal of policy at the RNC this week, including on economic policy. Yep. And interesting to hear from Chairman Powell about not just the nature of where interest rates are going and how confident he is in the inflation data we're seeing, but also speaking of things like the deficit and the independence of the Fed.
The independence of the Fed and I guess the non-political nature of the Fed.
Yes.
So many questions about whether September is in play here. Kaylee, pretty interesting conversation in a way that only David Rubenstein could bring to us. And I will note here, as we take a look at the markets, Kaylee, the theme of this first day of the Republican National Convention is the economy. Mm-hmm. And that is what we're going to be hearing lawmakers and other dignitaries speaking to later on today.
Yeah, and of course, as you mentioned, checking out the markets here, the S&P 500 up about 0.4% off on the day. We're off session highs, but still we're looking at records here. We're up about the same amount on the NASDAQ 100 and the Dow. Interesting to see the bond market not reacting too much, though. If you look at that sensitive 2-year yield to Fed policy, we were actually down on the day by a couple of basis points. Now we're exactly even. The 2-year at 4.45 at the moment. The 10-year yield is up by about 5 basis points. We're looking at about 4.23 there. Of course, when you're the chairman of the Federal Reserve, what you are often trying to do is make sure that you do not move the markets and break any news. But let's see if we did get any new information from the Fed chairman and bring in Bloomberg's Michael McKee, our international economics and policy correspondent. So, Mike, we did hear from Powell there talking about the idea that, yes, there was more confidence given to the Fed by the second quarter inflation data, if not the first. What does that mean as we look ahead to September?
Well, it doesn't mean a whole lot right now, but it does suggest that the Fed's getting closer to a rate cut. Powell seemed relatively confident about the progress that they have made. He noted that the last 3 inflation readings, including the most recent CPI, have been encouraging, but he didn't want to go as far as saying this gives us the confidence we need to cut. And then he went on to say, I'm not going to give any hints about policy at future meetings today. So basically, he's leaving his options open, but it does kind of take July off the table in the sense that the Fed doesn't like to surprise markets. So the idea that he would, at this point, cut rates without already starting to hint at it. He didn't do that. So it probably means they're not going to do something in July. What's interesting, though, and you can see it there, is the measure of September rate cut, which had been priced in earlier today, is now priced out slightly at 96 basis points. It would be 100 basis points for one cut. So markets are taking a sort of pessimistic view of this in general, although I guess some areas of the stock market are starting to price in the idea of a rate cut.
Well, it's interesting, Michael, the headline, we don't put political filters on our decisions. Wasn't that the chairman's way of saying that September is in play?
Yeah, it's a way of saying September is in play. It's the same answer that he and every other member of the Open Market Committee give when asked, because a lot of people are looking at the calendar saying September 18th is pretty close to Election Day. There's no other meeting before Election Day, so they could cut rates then, which might be seen as an effort to help the incumbent. And the Fed has always argued that they don't do that, and history has shown that they don't let politics interfere. I think more important to the Fed is the idea that there are members of the party that is meeting in Milwaukee who have suggested changes to the Fed's mandates, and they are concerned about that. They don't want anybody to open up the Federal Reserve Act because all sorts of bad things could happen in terms of Fed independence.
Well, and that is kind of what we heard from the chairman at the end there, Mike. He talked about Fed independence and the idea that if he were to give advice to his successor, that they should not risk the temptation around expanding the mandate, which of course right now is just maximum employment and a 2% inflation target. As we think about the balance between those two sides of the mandate, though, hearing the chairman talking about the labor market there, is it now more really about the jobs picture than about the inflation picture, given where inflation levels have been able to come down to, even though we're not yet at 2%?
Well, it is to the extent that we see inflation continue to move down. Of course, any upward surprise would change the calculation. But right now, they are keeping an eye on the unemployment rate because it has risen. We're at 4.1%, which is where they thought we'd be at the end of the year. So if it goes significantly higher, that might pull forward a rate cut, make September definite, make July a possibility. We'll get the first week of August, the July unemployment figures. So that's something to keep an eye on. But his view was today, as it has been all this month in his various appearances, that unemployment and inflation are pretty much in balance now. They're positioned to move either way, depending on which one moves. But it's no longer that the unemployment rate is too low and that we have a very tight labor market that's pushing up inflation. So that's an encouraging sign for investors.
Michael, it's great to have you with us here at Bloomberg's Michael McKee on a special edition of Balance of Power live from Milwaukee. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons as we keep our eyes on Fiserv Forum, where day one of the RNC is happening just a couple of blocks from where we're sitting here at Bloomberg TV and radio in the field, and we assemble our political panel at this important moment. Rick Davis is with us right now, Stone Court Capital partner, alongside Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University and senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. It's great to have both of you with us here. We're waiting on an announcement for a running mate. And the clock is ticking here. Rick, what's happening behind closed doors right now? Because obviously Donald Trump knows who this is. What is the campaign doing to prepare this unveiling?
Yeah, right now, part of what's happening is that the would-be vice president is meeting his team. There's a whole staff that's been built to take him or her from this venue onto a next 3 months of campaigning. And so it's not without its resources and whatnot. And then there's this last minute going through the speeches and making sure they're fine-tuned. They're going to be spending a little bit of time when the delegates aren't in the hall to go and do their walkthroughs to see the stage for the first time. It's probably one of the things Donald Trump will do today, maybe right now. And so there's like administrative things, but by and large, there isn't much politics being done other than, the speeches. But they're also designing these moments, right? The thing you remember from the conventions are one or two emotional moments, when the president walks in and sees the crowd for the first time, or the president and first lady, or, the candidate and his spouse, have some kind of gesture or something that's said at the stage. So that's what the organizers of this convention are trying to do, is figure out what's our moment going to be tonight. And of course, if Donald Trump shows up, that's a ready-made moment.
Well, absolutely. And it does seem that the integrity of the moment with which we all find out who the vice presidential pick actually is to this point has been preserved. It hasn't leaked out. We're all still laying in wait. And Rick, earlier in the program, you were bringing up the idea that it could be someone like Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin, even though we don't understand him to be on the short list at this time. We're looking at instead Burgum, Rubio, J.D. Vance. And I wonder about the state of Virginia, Jeannie, as we just got new New York Times Siena polling today. Looks just at two states, Pennsylvania, Biden's home state, and where the shooting happened this weekend, and Virginia. And we should advise our listeners and viewers, this poll did happen prior to the shooting, so we have to have that caveat in there. But it shows Trump leading in Pennsylvania. And in Virginia, Biden is only ahead by 3 points, 48 to 45, within the margin of error. So would someone like Glenn Youngkin be a smart pick for Trump? Could he actually turn Virginia red again?
He could. I mean, it is fascinating. I was just looking at this poll. I mean, the idea that Joe Biden is losing at this point, according to this poll, we have to say Pennsylvania, his home state, and then next door nearby, Virginia, which Democrats, of course, it is really, I think, in my mind, a must win for Democrats. So should that go red, that is a huge problem for the Democrats. And so that does make Glenn Youngkin an attractive, appealing vice presidential candidate. I'm also curious, does the shooting over the weekend change Donald Trump's mind? I mean, all things being equal, if that had never happened, perhaps he had made his choice and stuck with it. But do you move away from somebody like J.D. Vance with a much tougher rhetoric to somebody like a Glenn Youngkin or a Doug Burgum, who have this sort of less rhetorical, strong statements that they've made that may be off-putting to moderates? I also note that they have now added Nikki Haley to the lineup to speak this week. Not that she's in the running to be VP as far as we know, but that's another interesting turn. So he does keep us waiting and watching and wondering. And I think when he gets in there, whether it's tonight or later this week, it is going to be one of those moments that Rick was just talking about that we all remember, especially given the fact the entire nation is rooting for him health-wise, considering what he has just survived.
Donald Trump did an interview with the Washington Examiner in which he said he rewrote his speech. It was going to be a humdinger, he said. Rick, honestly, it's going to be a whole different speech now. It's a chance to bring the country together. I was given that chance. I don't know if you believe the words you're hearing, but he has a moment, a delicate opportunity here to seize on. How different do you think that speech will be than it might have been on Friday?
Oh, I'm suspecting it's probably substantially different. I think you can't imagine what impact just escaping death has on Donald Trump or on anybody else. You can, try to put yourself in that mind frame. But certainly the organizers of the campaign, the managers and the speechwriters and the folks who are charged with getting the most bump out of this convention as they can, they haven't missed that point. And the last thing they want is a divisive political speech where Donald Trump goes up to the podium and eviscerates Joe Biden. And so no doubt everyone's aligned on this. Donald Trump probably feels this way. The campaign's going to want to see something different. And so it's not just Donald Trump's speech. Whoever has been crafting the vice president's speech is going to be having to echo that. It may change the lineup of who introduces the vice presidential candidate. Currently, we had Donald Trump Jr., another pit bull of the Republican Party. I wouldn't be surprised to see a change made there. So I think you're going to see a kindler, gentler Republican convention moving out. No, nonetheless political, but definitely tonally different.
Well, and what goes for Republicans also probably goes for Joe Biden as his campaign, at least in rethinking your tone and the way in which you message, be it a threat to democracy or anything else. And I would point out that while we await to hear Donald Trump speak at the convention later this week, we will hear more from Joe Biden this evening as he sits down for an interview on NBC with Lester Holt after hearing from him 3 times within the last several days since the shooting, including an Oval Office address last night where he was talking about unity. Jeannie, knowing that there is going to be this split screen of the RNC and a vice presidential pick up against this interview, What is the winning message here for Joe Biden? What's he trying to do?
I thought his statement yesterday or last night was very strong. I think we're going to hear more of that. He's going to talk about uniting the country, the idea that we don't resolve our differences with guns or with violence. We do it at the ballot box. And I think it's very important that he called and spoke to Donald Trump. We have already noticed on the Republican side some modulating of rhetoric. People like Vivek Ramaswamy, who is a bit of a pit bull like Donald Trump Jr. and J.D. Vance. His tone seems to have moderated. So I don't know if we are just being Pollyannish and hopeful that the tone is moderating. We are, after all, going into a Republican convention, and any convention is about, opposition to your opponents politically. But it does seem like there is a change. And I will just say I've noticed in Donald Trump's rhetoric in particular, this talk about a conversion, the idea that this had that impact that Rick was just talking about, and that Ronald Reagan talked about after he was shot. It changed his life and what he hoped to do and did as president. Now, I don't know if that's going to happen with Donald Trump, but that some of that and that really fascinating interview in the Washington Examiner with Selena Zito, that was fascinating. And the fact that he called her was in and of itself really a remarkable moment.
Yeah, she was at the event.
She was there with her daughter.
And I guess they had an interview set up. He felt bad that they didn't have the opportunity. It is pretty remarkable here. Does Joe Biden need to make news tonight? Or is this simply about normalizing, as Jeannie indicated, the idea of doing interviews like these?
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of inappropriateness by the president sort of, horning in on the first night of the Republican convention. In years gone by, there's sort of an understanding that you sort of give the opposition party their convention. So I think, I would be shocked if he tried to make news. I buy what Jeannie's saying, that he's just trying to remain relevant. Remember, it was only a couple of days ago we were talking about getting, the Democratic Party purging him from their ticket. Right. And so I think he's trying to manage the transition back to being a favorite of the Democrats. And I think certainly the White House and his campaign feel they need to have him out there showing people that he's vibrant and can handle the difficulties of a presidential campaign and the presidency. So I think that's what tonight's all about.
All right, Rick Davis of Stone Court Capital and Jeannie Shanzano of Iona University, Bloomberg Politics contributors in our political panel here in Milwaukee. Thank you so much. And still ahead, we'll be joined by former Homeland Security official Ashley Davis amid the heightened security here at the RNC in the aftermath of the attempted assassination of Donald Trump over the weekend. We'll have more next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
What about artificial intelligence? Is artificial intelligence going to enable you and others to say, we have enough information to know exactly what something is going to be worth in terms of insuring it or not?
Artificial intelligence is finding its way into our business in a variety of different factors. I think the first piece is getting much better insight into data, which allows us to make better decisions on underwriting. It's also a great opportunity to service business better in terms of like call centers and different ways of what's using robotics and other AI will be very helpful. But it is an emerging practice within the industry and one that is evolving very quickly. So it's also going to present risks that other companies, how they use it and how they use large language models and making sure the decision making is very sound. So it's complicated, but it definitely is benefiting the business today.
Saturday mornings, I understand you have off. Saturday is always a day where I power down. So I run at a relative high pace throughout the week, try to wrap things up, and Saturday is a quiet day for me in terms of work. And I start typically by playing tennis with my wife. We go for a swim all year round. After that, have a nice lunch, and then I'm on to a good trajectory for the weekend. And then Sunday, I try to prepare for the coming weeks. But through a weekend, I would send either no emails or very few emails, because I want to drive a culture where all get an opportunity to spend the weekend as they fancy. I think what we do is so difficult, and it takes so much creative thinking to succeed, that if you're always on, always busy, the bandwidth of your reflection is just too narrow. And I generally believe that Monday mornings I'm a better leader than I am, say, Friday afternoon. I also take all my vacations. I generally believe I'm a much better CEO right after a vacation than I am before vacation.
It's the world's second largest economy with a growing influence in global affairs. But geopolitical uncertainties, deflationary pressures, and questions about foreign investment linger. Bloomberg, The China Show, brings you the unmatched expertise you need to keep track of breaking news, in-depth market analysis, and the most influential newsmakers in and around China. Bloomberg, The China Show. Weekdays at 9 a.m. Hong Kong time, right here on Bloomberg. Context changes everything. Bloomberg Surveillance covers the latest in global markets and the political events that influence your world. Join Jonathan Farrell, Lisa Abramowitz, and Anne-Marie Hordern only on Bloomberg. Context changes everything. From the world of politics to the world of business. 2 times a day at 1 p.m. and 5 p.m. Eastern Time, hosts Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons deliver news, insight, and analysis from and about politics' biggest power players.
The president has been clear that is non-negotiable.
I mean, this is going to be an ugly, ugly year.
Balance of Power, live around the world twice a day at 1 and 5 Eastern, only on Bloomberg TV and radio. Context changes everything.
This is a special Balance of Power live from the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee on Bloomberg TV and radio. Welcome back. I'm Kaylee Lyons alongside Joe Matthew, where the news flow has been incessant as we await a vice presidential selection from Donald Trump and continue to assess the aftermath of the attempted assassination of the former president over the weekend. We also got more news in legal land. It's news that maybe favors Donald Trump as well, as the documents case in Florida, Judge Aileen Cannon presiding over it, has now been thrown out by that judge on the grounds that the appointment of Jack Smith, the special counsel who brought the case, was appointed unconstitutionally. So let's go now to Bloomberg's Sarah Forden, who leads our legal coverage out of Washington. Sarah, how unexpected was this, knowing that, yes, Aileen Cannon had been criticized for slow walking this case? We knew it probably wasn't going to go to trial before the election, but to throw it out entirely, was this expected?
Well, she had been briefing on this topic. She had held hearings, and then she got fundamental support from the opinion just 2 weeks ago in the Supreme Court decision on immunity, where Justice Clarence Thomas specifically raised this question of the constitutionality of the special counsel, and her opinion cites his opinion. So that is kind of the connection here. The ruling today did come as quite a surprise, however.
Sarah, it's Joe. It's great to have you with us here as we join you from Milwaukee today. Let's cut to the chase then. Now that we've had this happen today, there will be no other trials for Donald Trump after New York, right?
We are not seeing any trials on the horizon, at least not before November. This ruling does also raise a question for the January 6th case and whether that will become an issue in that case. But first, more likely, this whole question of the constitutionality of the special counsel is likely to head back to the Supreme Court, where at this point only Justice Clarence Thomas has raised this issue, but certainly there are other conservatives on the court who may well agree with him.
Well, and it's important, Sarah, to consider here, and we were discussing this with a member of the House Judiciary Committee, Congresswoman Victoria Spartz, earlier on the program, the suggestion that a special counsel's appointment may have not been in keeping with the constitutional duties of Congress to have some kind of role. Would that then throw into question, say, the special counsel that brought the case against the president, current president's son, Hunter Biden, David Weiss? Would it call into question special counsel Hur, who was investigating Biden's own handling of classified documents? Just how far could this extend?
So we're taking a look at all the other challenges to special counsels, and the famous, special counsels have been used throughout American history to review some of our most controversial situations. But in the case of David Weiss, the Hunter Biden special counsel, he was actually a U.S. attorney who had been approved and confirmed by the Senate. So under her reasoning, he would be okay to continue his work. Her point was that Jack Smith was a private citizen. There's no basis for a private citizen to be kind of lobbed into a prosecutorial role unless Congress has explicitly either confirmed that person or passes a law saying that this is an acceptable role for a private citizen.
Mm-hmm. So, Sarah, what's the next important stop on the road here in Donald Trump's legal journey? Is it sentencing in New York in September?
Well, first of all, we are expecting Jack Smith to appeal this particular ruling, so there will very likely be more action in the Florida classified documents case. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a question over whether they are going to try to get Cannon removed from the case and start over. So, of course, all of that would take a lot of time. The next step in the hush money case in New York is for the District Attorney Bragg to respond to the immunity question there. We are expecting Judge Merchan to hold hearings on that, so it's likely the sentencing could even be postponed longer.
With us live from Washington, Sarah, thank you. Bloomberg's Sarah Forden here on Balance of Power. As we turn our attention back to the Republican National Convention here in Milwaukee, I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons with the calm before the convention. Joining us now, Ashley Davis, former Homeland Security official and former White House official in the Bush 43 administration. Ashley, it's great to see you in Milwaukee. Thank you for joining us here at the table. Sure. I'm sure you're very busy throughout this week. We remind our viewers and listeners that you were the second person in the door at the brand new Department of Homeland Security. Of course, in the wake of 9/11, which was a game changer for security, what happened on Saturday, the attempted assassination of Donald Trump, will be a game changer again?
I think so. I mean, actually, just so I don't insult any of my former colleagues, I was actually employee number one at the White House Office of Homeland Security after 9/11. Most forget that the department wasn't created until 2003, which is very important these days because when the department was created is when they put in place the National Special Security Events, which is what the convention is. Both conventions are right now. So there's $75 million that have been given both the Republican convention and the Democrat convention for the Secret Service to take the lead with other security agencies to make sure that this facility as well as Chicago will be very safe. I think the problem right now is the fact that do we have any confidence in the Secret Service? And so I think that's my question, but I would think
that you have to ask that openly is terrifying.
Absolutely. I mean, what happened Saturday, first of all, it's where I grew up. So I know the area very, very well. The fact that there's very limited, and I'm sure you've heard this many times and so as your viewers, there's very limited buildings there. So the fact that there was, a football field and a half that this person is really what it is, away from the president. And this morning I saw that the Secret Service is still blaming local law enforcement, which to me, one, we have to remember the Secret Service are the people that actually put the perimeter in place. And two, they cannot say that this is the local law enforcement's fault. It is a major security breach that stops at the top of the Secret Service.
Well, it also raises the question as to when that breach should have potentially been intercepted. If it really was physically at the location, that individual shouldn't have been able to access the roof with a semi-automatic rifle, or is it a failure in intelligence gathering before that? The idea that there could have been this threat out there against Donald Trump that wasn't accurately assessed. I guess just where in the process is the flaw?
I think I think that planning, number one, that there wasn't someone on that building when it was that close. There should be, and usually just in my former life doing so many events with presidential events, you have people on all those buildings. So the fact that someone was not on that building and then took time to climb up the building, I think that it started beforehand in planning of not having someone there, to answer your question. But I also think the fact that they left that amount of time to have during the actual event is where it really broke down. But I think it's a long process. And going back to your other question about the intelligence before the event, there is so much intelligence happening always, but especially now in this divisive world that we live in, that there are so many threats against both of these candidates that
hard to sort through the noise.
Exactly, but still, that's why you put these people on top of these buildings so it wouldn't happen. And the other thing that was just crazy to me, and a bunch of former Secret Service people were saying it today as well, is the fact that they let him. It's an iconic photo, what happened of him standing up, and that's amazing. But there could have been 3 shooters, even though the one was dead at that point.
So that in itself was a failure.
Absolutely. I mean, I think this is going to be I can't imagine what's going to happen with the investigative people at the Department of Homeland Security, Inspector General, that will do a report on this and see what happened. I mean, it's a major failure.
Is it time to rethink this entire apparatus? Kayleigh mentions we spent time with Congresswoman Spartz earlier. And I asked her if it's time to renew this debate over whether members of Congress should have security details. I don't know if that would be part of the Secret Service or part of the Capitol Police. I know it would come at extreme cost. But to your point, the threats continue to increase.
Absolutely. And if you talk to any members of Congress, they're really nervous right now.
Can we afford to do that, or can we afford not to do that?
Look what we spend money on. So I would think that we definitely can afford if it's a priority. I don't think that you would probably do Secret Service. I mean, obviously, there's Capitol Police that do the Speaker of the House and the Majority Minority Leader in the Senate. So I think there's still different levels of security with the Secretary of State is actually security through the Secretary of State. The Treasury Secretary is through that. It's not all Secret Service. So you may be able to do different. Private security, I mean, if I was a member of Congress right now with a high enough profile, I would be outsourcing my own security through my campaign money.
Well, think of Senator Mitt Romney, who has had to fund his own security for him and his family. This is a very real thing. So as we consider the security of ourselves right now, as we are in Milwaukee for the Republican convention, we all have had to contend with, I'm sure at this point, the perimeter, and maybe have had some items confiscated in the case of my aluminum water bottle, even though it was empty.
Oh, I didn't know about
So for anyone who's entering the perimeter here in Milwaukee, don't bring your water bottles. But the point is, we're here for the Republican convention, which in many ways is likely to change in tone this week as a result of what happened. But there are some things that still need to happen, including the selection of the vice president. We're expecting it's going to come at some point today. Donald Trump has said as much. How did the events of the last 48 hours change your thinking about who it's likely to be?
With his tone of unity, and obviously President Biden's as well, but former President Trump's unity message, I would think that if Senator Vance was going to be the nominee, that you may rethink that because of he's kind of a flamethrower in regards to some of the things he said, especially after what he said on Saturday. From what we all understand, we're going to hear this afternoon, late afternoon, about the vice presidential candidate. I personally think if you have someone like Governor Burgum or Governor Youngkin from Virginia, that they are probably someone that are more middle of the road in regards to how they talk about different things and would be a safer bet, in my opinion. And I really don't think that he did know who it was going to be until recently, and I definitely think that this would change his
perception. Reuters is now reporting that Marco Rubio has been informed that he is not going to be Donald Trump's vice president. So now we're going to go through this process of elimination all day. It would be classic Trump for this to be no one from the short list.
Totally.
Right? That he had us off the scent the whole time.
Which is why there is a kind of a swelling of information about Governor Youngkin. And then you still have people that are thinking, well, was it going to be Nikki? And I do think that there is a possibility that it's somebody.
Nikki Haley?
Would you say?
Are you allowing for that?
I would love it to be Nikki, as you know.
Yeah.
But I'm also a huge Doug Burgum fan, so, but I do agree with you. I mean, this is kind of his thing, to make it nobody that he's talking about. But that's interesting about Rubio. A lot of people were hoping that as well.
But he doesn't have to move now.
Well, that was the question. They're both Florida men. So how do you get around that? Marco Rubio may have had to change his residency to another state. Again, this is just Reuters reporting it. Bloomberg has not independently confirmed it, but it does feel kind of, if not The Apprentice, like the weakest link, like just a one-by-one elimination.
Exactly. Right? The other thing that's interesting is there was a huge Twitter blow up today that J.D. Vance left his house in a motorcade, but it's been confirmed that that was secret. That was not Secret Service, but VP motorcade. That was from the governor of Ohio. Gave J.D. Vance some protection, which he probably needs. So
what are your broader thoughts then as we get into day one here, the change in tone that we've already talked about, Donald Trump rewriting the speech? Is this going to feel or look different tonight than you expected?
Absolutely. I mean, even him going back to reaching out to Nikki yesterday, or on Sunday, yesterday, I guess, and asking her to speak. I do think that there is a unity conversation. If you did see, they did there was going to be a floor fight, so to speak, about the abortion issue and the platform, that how they changed the platform to say that they're going to let this up to the states, which obviously angered a lot of pro-life people, that they did cancel that floor fight. I do think that there's a lot of things that will not be happening in regards to kind of the contentious issues. His tone, also, the campaign has been calling the speakers. Tim Scott speaking this evening, I just heard. So he's probably not the VP candidate, I would think.
There you go.
But that they've asked all the speakers to not be talking about Saturday in regards to
that is
fueling the
fascinating.
fire. Yeah.
We'll leave that, I guess, to the former president on Thursday.
Exactly. So, and I think someone said it really well today. When you we're this close, like literally, from dying and getting hit with a bullet, maybe it's really has changed.
Yeah, a reminder of everyone's mortality.
Absolutely.
Ashley Davis, former Homeland Security official and also a hometown girl from the Pennsylvania town in which all of this went down yesterday. Great to have you with us here in Milwaukee. And of course, Joe, we aren't done yet. We still have a vice president, well, at least to find out who the pick is, and more coverage coming up later today.
It's only day one. We've barely begun, and we will have a lot more for you later today on Bloomberg. See you back here at 5 p.m. Eastern Time on the late edition of
Want Ethereum exposure right in your brokerage account? Get it with symbol ETHE. Grayscale Ethereum Trust, the world's largest Ethereum fund. ETHE. Crypto investing begins here.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenivek on Bloomberg Radio.
And a very good afternoon, everybody, live on Bloomberg Radio, television, YouTube, and Bloomberg Originals. Yes, it is Monday, July 15th, 2024. I'm Carol Masser along with Tim Stenivek. And this, Tim, on a day where we are once again looking at stocks hitting all-time highs, the S&P 500 could possibly hit its 38th record for the year.
Okay, we're going to have more on markets in just a minute. Also up this hour, Carlyle co-founder David Rubenstein standing by. We're going to join him in just a second. He's fresh from his conversation with Fed Chair Jay Powell.
We were listening to it word for word, chuckling a little too at times.
It's a different Jay Powell, I felt like. Very comfortable.
A really great conversation. We're going to get into it in just a moment. Plus, the Bloomberg Big Take. It's among our most read stories on the Bloomberg on this Monday. On the same savvy impulse that powered Donald Trump's first successful campaign for the presidency, as well as his 2024 bid. We're going to get into it, so much as you would expect to talk about when it comes to the upcoming November race.
Also, some big banks having reported. We're going to get the latest on bank earnings a little bit later in the hour.
All right, first up, let's get you up to date on the trade on this Monday and some of your top business stories. For that, we turn things over to our own Charlie Pellet.
Thank you very much indeed. Lots going on today with the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all pushing higher. As you mentioned, could see yet another record for the S&P 500 index. Right now at 56.28, up 12, gain of 0.2%. S&P trading at record levels. Do want to begin with a headline, though, from the Bloomberg Professional Service. Florida Senator Marco Rubio, has been informed that he will not be Donald Trump's vice presidential pick. This, according to Reuters, in a post on social media platform X, with Reuters citing sources. Again, that headline right now, Florida Senator Marco Rubio, according to Reuters, has been informed that he will not be Donald Trump's vice presidential pick. S&P, as I mentioned, higher right now by about 0.2%, 56.27. The Dow's up 163, now up by about 0.4%. The NASDAQ Composite Index up 42, a gain there of 0.2%. The big news, though, the surge in the Russell 2000 Index, a broad-based rally today. Russell 2000 up now by 1.7%. 10-year 4.22%, the 2-year 4.45%. Spot gold up $9 the ounce, up by about 0.4%, while West Texas Intermediate crude is down 0.6%, 81.75 for a barrel of WTI. We've got Apple shares advancing today. Apple climbing to a record, up 1.7% after the tech giant was named a top pick at Morgan Stanley, with the broker seeing the launch of the company's AI platform triggering a record rush among users to upgrade their smartphones, tablets, and computers. Again, Apple climbing to a record in the session, up now by 1.7%. Recapping, stocks higher, S&P up 14, up 0.2%, 10-year 4.22%. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Got it. Charlie, thank you so much. Carol Masser, along with Tim Stenivek, live here on Bloomberg Business Week. Well, about 90 minutes ago, Bloomberg host and Carlyle co-founder and co-chairman David Rubenstein sat down with Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell at an Economic Club of Washington luncheon event. Now, keep in mind, this conversation coming less than a week after 2 days of congressional testimony from Chair Powell, followed by a cooler than expected June CPI report. And of course, it comes ahead of another FOMC meeting that's just at the end of this month. There's a lot going on. Here's what Fed Chair Jay Powell had to say, among many comments, to Mr. Rubenstein.
On inflation, in the first quarter we didn't make any more progress. The second quarter, actually, we did make some more progress. We've had now 3 better readings, and if you average them, that's a pretty good pace.
All right, that, of course, is Fed Chair Jay Powell just about 90 minutes ago with David Rubenstein. And among our most read stories on the Bloomberg at this hour has to do with those comments, and specifically Chair Powell talking about second quarter economic data, providing policymakers at the Fed greater confidence that inflation is indeed heading down to the central bank's 2% goal, possibly giving the way for near-term interest rate cuts. There's a lot of speculation. September, could it even happen in July?
Well, he also said that the 3 latest inflation readings, including one that we just got last week, Carol, made clear that he didn't intend to send any specific message about the timing of rate reductions.
Yeah, he said specifically, we didn't get any additional confidence in the first quarter, but the 3 readings in the second quarter, including the one from last week, do add somewhat to confidence. Again, Jay Powell speaking with David Rubenstein. And what's interesting is, we have had many conversations around this table, Tim, about the importance of not just one inflation or softer inflation reading report, not just 2, but more like 3, and that was really important to see a trend line, a sustainable trend line in terms of easing inflation.
Hey, as we're continuing to chat about that conversation that David had with Jay Powell, we're getting some headlines coming out of the Republican Party. Former President Trump has picked a vice president, this according to Fox News, though Fox News does not report on the identity of Trump's running mate. We are expecting the former president to announce his running mate a little later on the program, about 4:30 this afternoon.
Yeah, and we're going to head to our Kelly Lyons. She is at the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee, so we have a lot to obviously talk about when it comes to just the political environment. It was also something that David got into with Jay Powell, and often he's asked about, or there's often a lot of speculation that we have about the importance of, or how could potentially the November race impact Fed policy of when they choose to potentially cut rates or not to cut rates, because there is certainly a meeting before, there's one right after. Does the timing have anything to say? And not surprisingly.
No, not surprisingly. The Fed has political independence, and it's something that Jay Powell has talked about a lot. A great question, though, that David asked him was about if he would stay on. Mm-hmm. And again, he demurred, not wanting to weigh in on that at all when his term is up, if he would actually stay on. But he said he's very much enjoying the job, and he's enjoyed his time on the Fed. He's proud of it.
Exactly. The Fed chief, though, also cemented a shift in tone among some central bank officials toward emphasizing potential risks to the labor market alongside their continued focus on lowering inflation. And I think it is safe to say, in terms of the Fed narrative, that we have seen Jay Powell and the like, FOMC members and other policymakers here in the United States, monetary policymakers, talk a lot more about the dual mandate, but Jay Powell in particular, not just that focus on inflation, but concerns about some softening specifically in the U.S. jobs market.
Yeah, Powell's been so clear about that his dual mandate from Congress are those 2 things, Carol, and that's what they do. Everything is in the service of those 2, of that dual mandate.
All right, folks, we have teed it up for you. Let's get to our key interview this hour with Carlyle's David Rubenstein. David, of course, host of peer-to-peer conversations on Bloomberg Television and Radio. You can catch David's interview with Fed Chair Jay Powell on the David Rubenstein Show, peer-to-peer, airing July 24th at 9 p.m. Wall Street time on Bloomberg TV. Let's go to the source. David, patiently waiting for us in our Washington, D.C. bureau. David, great to have you here. We've been counting down to your conversation with Jay Powell. We watched. How did this come about? Was it planned for a long time? I'm just curious.
Okay. Well, I am the chairman of the Economic Club of Washington, and in that capacity, I often interview government leaders and business leaders, and Jay Powell had been somebody I'd interviewed before. Mm-hmm. He had worked at my firm a number of years ago, well before he was at the Fed, and so we worked out a date that I would do this interview today, and we had about 700 people there, and obviously a live TV audience.
David, we were chuckling the whole time. I mean, this was like a Powell that you don't see at press conferences, a Powell that you don't see every day. It's clear that you 2 are familiar with one another. What did you want to get out of the interview? Because we know that he's not going to give us any indication about a rate path. He established that at the top of the interview. What did you want to get out of it?
Well, I think it's always good to humanize well-known people, and people can understand them better and the way they make decisions and the way they kind of handle their job. And I thought humanizing him would be always good. Clearly, when you're chairman of the Fed, you talk in what I've often called Fed speak, which is to say it's very difficult for the average person to understand it. But Jay does a better job than some of his predecessors in speaking in common English because he's not a trained economist. And I just thought giving people an update on his perspectives on the economy would be a good thing. I mean, obviously, as you point out, he's not going to announce at an interview with me that he's lowering interest rates. You can't expect that. But I think he gave a pretty good description of how they decide to lower interest rates or increase interest rates. And I thought it was informative. And therefore, I thought, he accomplished his goal, which is to kind of, show people how he makes decisions. And I accomplished my goal, which is to kind of humanize the chairman of the Fed a little bit more than maybe he otherwise would be.
Well, David, help us understand your relationship. You mentioned that you guys do go back years, of course. He was a partner at the Carlyle